from Kansas State University, this is Agriculture Today. Eric Atkinson with you. Here's what's coming up. K-State's Nathan Nelson and Elliott Carver will join us. They'll discuss their multi-year look at how winter cover crops, coupled with phosphorus fertilizer management, impact surface water quality. They evaluated how cover crops contribute to retaining phosphorus on the field and the difference made by the phosphorus application method there. Also with us today from the Washburn University School of Law, Roger McEowen. This time, Roger taking a close look at the state of California's Proposition 12 statute, which he says has broad implications not only for the pork industry, but for all of production agriculture in this country. And later, K-State's Gus Vander Hoeven with another Stop, Look, and Listen. All that here on Agriculture Today. You're tuned in to the midweek edition of Agriculture Today. Glad to have you along with us as we'll share research information out of the Department of Agronomy here at Kansas State University, which weaves in yet another look at the value of cover crops in a crop production rotation. In this case, the impacts on water quality. With us is soil fertility nutrient management researcher here at K-State, Nathan Nelson, and a graduate researcher working directly with Nathan on this and other projects, Elliott Carver. And you've been examining, Nathan, cover crops as well as phosphorus fertilizer management in combination and how those impact surface water quality. Tell more about the intent and the aim of this study, if you would.
Sure. A little background. We've got water quality is a pretty important issue here in the state. We've got several water sources, major reservoirs, rivers that have excessive algae growth. And nutrients like phosphorus, we put them in our fields to increase our crop growth. When they get into water, they increase algae growth, and that can cause water quality problems. We'd like to keep those nutrients in the field. And several years ago, we had quite a few questions coming in from producers who were looking for using broadcast fertilizer management, a simplified, less expensive management method, but might have more risks of phosphorus loss and more water quality concerns. And they said, well, what if we use cover crops? I said, if we use a cover crop, can we then broadcast our fertilizer? And we couldn't find good answers for that. And so we set up this project with large plots, about 1.2 acres in size, equipped to collect runoff so we can look at the runoff that's coming from natural rainfall and look at this over the course of a growing season, over multiple years, to really understand how changes in management practices will affect water quality.
But this was done over 5 years' time. Actually, it's ongoing yet, you say?
Yes. Elliott worked for us with the first 5 years of the project, and based on those, that information, we've changed a few treatments to investigate further some of the things that we couldn't answer with the first part of the study.
Well, Elliott, bring you in, and the cropping system that you were working these cover crops into, what was it?
Sure. So we are currently in a no-till corn-soybean rotation. And then as far as our phosphorus fertilizer practices, we have plots where we don't apply any phosphorus fertilizer. That's our control. And then we have a fall broadcast where we're surface applying phosphorus fertilizer. Then we also have a spring-injected fertilizer treatment where we apply phosphorus at planting. And then we have each one of those phosphorus fertilizer treatments with and without a winter-sown cover crop.
So you have covered the gamut there as far as application methods for the phosphorus. And the winter cover crops, what specifically were you using?
Sure. So our cover crops kind of vary from year to year, but typically we stick with a small grain mixed with a brassica. I feel like that's a pretty common practice in the area and kind of gives us a good real-world representation of what's going on.
The thought going in was that those might allow for phosphorus to stay put, so to speak, upon application to those, right?
Right. Our hope was that adding a cover crop into our fertilized systems would actually reduce our phosphorus loss through potential assimilation of phosphorus in the crop tissue. And we also know that cover crops do a great job of reducing erosion, so also try to reduce that in our system as well.
And establishing these cover crops fairly handy in this system, presumably so?
I think so. I think it was a pretty smooth transition. We planted our cover crops after harvest and during a a period of time where we didn't really have much going on in the field normally. So we would plant our cover crops during a normally fallow period.
Let's get right to your discovery over the 5 years that you're looking at now and how well those cover crops function differently with the different phosphorus applications you examined.
So I think when we think about what we've seen from a water quality standpoint, we can look at it both from a phosphorus fertilizer standpoint and a cover crop standpoint. And if it's okay with you, I think that's a kind of way to go about it. So from a phosphorus fertilizer standpoint, what we found is that when we apply phosphorus fertilizer, not surprisingly, we see an increase in phosphorus loss from the field compared to our control. Again, makes total sense. We're putting that phosphorus on, we're going to see more losses. But when we compare the fall broadcast versus the spring injected, we find that the spring injected has less loss compared to the fall broadcast. Now, when we add in a cover crop, what we see is that the cover crop does not decrease the increased losses in the fall broadcast. But when it comes to total phosphorus, we actually find that cover crops have an inconsistent effect on total phosphorus loss. Some years increasing total P loss, some years decreasing, some years having no effect at all.
So you say the cover crop performance for this purpose was a bit on the inconsistent side from time to time within your multi-year study here. Why the inconsistency, Elliott?
Right. So we saw an inconsistent effect on total phosphorus loss with our cover crop. But what we saw was that our cover crops do a great job of reducing sediment loss. And we know that when we reduce sediment loss, we're also reducing our particulate-bound P. So if we can reduce particulate-bound P, we should likely or hopefully decrease total P loss. But in addition to this particulate P, what we did see was that our cover crops in 3 out of 4 years increase our dissolved phosphorus loss. Now, this was something that we hadn't expected and was kind of an unintended consequence of adding our cover crop into our system. But really, this increase in dissolved P loss is kind of the driver for our variation in total P loss. Really, what we have found is that if our goal is to reduce phosphorus loss, especially in a system where we have normally low sediment loss, adding a cover crop may not be our best management to try to reduce phosphorus loss. We need to go back just focusing on fertilizer management is the real driver for reducing our P loss in those low sediment loss systems. But if we're in an area highly susceptible to erosion, adding a cover crop should decrease our erosion losses and decrease particulate-bound P being lost as well.
The increase in dissolved reactive phosphorus loss, we might expect that would be a cause for concern. I will say that total phosphorus is really what we're focused on. And if we look at the total phosphorus, 2 out of the 4 years, there was no effect on total phosphorus. 1 year it increased total phosphorus, 1 year it decreased. And so if we look at the whole thing, that total phosphorus piece, which tends to be the overall driver, was unchanged overall.
What we have found is that our cover crops do an excellent job at reducing sediment loss. So I mentioned we're in a no-till system, which is known for having lower amounts of sediment loss, but we're able to further reduce our sediment loss by adding a cover crop in this system.
But the method of application itself, that is, in this case, the injection, that's where the real gain is made here as far as retaining phosphorus, it sounds.
Correct.
How do we take away something from this, Nathan, as far as the value of cover crops in this system? Each of these components has a role to play in that water quality?
Definitely. So cover crops have done, like Elliott said, an excellent job of reducing sediment. And I should say that sediment is also a very important water quality concern here in the state. And I won't get into all the details there, but we really want to reduce sediment also. Great job of doing that. And so cover crops are great at reducing sediment, but when we're looking at reducing phosphorus loss, we really need additional best management practices. And that's where the fertilizer management comes in really important. You need both of them together. And we still need to collect soil samples, fertilize according to recommendations. No need to add additional fertilizer if we don't expect a yield response. Things like that. And then when we're managing that fertilizer, let's place it below the soil surface, and that's where we probably get our biggest bang for the buck when we're trying to reduce phosphorus loss.
And I think what we found with regards to cover crops is really, I think that cover crops are more of a site-specific tool. So in our areas that we know that we're going to have a lot of erosion, we could add in a cover crop to hopefully reduce total phosphorus loss through reduction in sediment loss.
Figure in average rainfall amounts, figure in slope of the field, so forth.
Exactly. Exactly. And then in our areas where sediment loss really isn't a major concern, maybe adding a cover crop isn't our best option for reducing phosphorus loss. And that's when we need to turn to phosphorus management and thinking about different ways to manage our phosphorus.
Nathan, you and Elliott are not done exploring this, though. You say this is an ongoing research work. What's the next interest or objective here?
The next interest or objective is to look at ways where we can manage the rate of phosphorus fertilizer application, and if, when you have a cover crop system, we might need to be applying a different rate of phosphorus. We're also trying to understand how these cover crops might increase the availability of phosphorus in the soil, whether for crop uptake or loss. So there's a potential that these cover crops, we have seen, I will say, that the cover crops have increased biological activity. They've increased several soil factors that would increase phosphorus cycling, and these things would lead to increased availability of phosphorus. And that's one reason why we might see an increased amount of dissolved phosphorus that's leaving the fields with the cover crops and makes the effect of cover crops on phosphorus loss variable.
Well, it's another angle on cover crop performance that's highly valuable because surface water quality remains a high priority out there on the land as we manage our crop production. So wishing you both the best as you continue to study this, and thank you for telling us about what you found over the last several years. Elliott, Nathan, appreciate your time.
Thank you very much.
Thanks, Eric.
Over from the Department of Agronomy at K-State, Nathan Nelson, soil fertility and nutrient management scientist at the university and a graduate researcher working with Nathan, Elliott Carver. Again, cover crops and phosphorus fertilizer management and their impacts on surface water quality. We'll be back with more for you after this. You're listening to Agriculture Today. We're back now on this Agriculture Today, and once more venturing into the field of agricultural law with Roger McEowen, professor of agricultural law and taxation, Washburn University School of Law, and with an item that, and this isn't overstating it, Roger, is critical to U.S. agriculture, you say. It's what's happened in California with its so-called Proposition 12 and how that might resonate with agricultural production beyond California's borders.
Well, Proposition 12 was enacted by voters in California back in 2018, and one of the things that it does, Eric, is that it requires any pork that's sold in California to be raised in accordance with California's housing requirements for hogs. And so what that means is that any U.S. hog producer, by the effective date of this, which will be January 1, 2022, so just coming up in a few months, any hog producer in the U.S. will need to upgrade existing facilities to satisfy California's regulations if they're currently deficient. And I can guarantee you those in the Midwest and in the Plains and other hog-producing areas of the United States are deficient compared to California standards, and you're going to have to upgrade to those standards if you want to market and sell your pork products in California. And that's a big issue. What you have, in essence, is one state dictating the production practices of agricultural products in other states.
And agriculture, once this emerged, challenged it right away in court and on the premise of what we know is the Commerce Clause, and then it digs a little deeper. You might outline that.
Yeah, again, what this does is ban the sale of whole pork meat, no matter where it's produced, from animals confined in a manner that's inconsistent with California's regulatory standards. Well, can you do that from a legal standpoint? Mm-hmm. And the way you answer that question is you look at the Commerce Clause of the U.S. Constitution, and that's Article 1, Section 8, and that gives the Congress the power to regulate commerce amongst the, as it says, the several states in the United States. Now, on its face, that doesn't impose any restrictions on states in the absence of congressional action. But over the years, the U.S. Supreme Court has interpreted the Commerce Clause as implicitly preempting state laws that regulate commerce in a manner that disrupts the national economy. That's what we call the Dormant Commerce Clause. That's a judicially created doctrine saying that states basically you can't cannibalize each other if it impacts the national economy. Now, there are some justices that don't believe that the Dormant Commerce Clause is a valid doctrine, and Justice Thomas would be one of those, and I think probably Justice Barrett would be in that same camp too. But the whole rationale behind the Commerce Clause is to protect the national economic market from opportunistic behavior by the states, to identify protectionist actions by state governments that are hostile to other states. And so, generally, that's where the Dormant Commerce Clause doctrine applies. It prohibits states from unduly interfering with interstate commerce. A state cannot discriminate by way of its regulations against interstate commerce, and if they do, their regulations are per se invalid.
Let us walk down the path, then, of the challenges to Proposition 12 that have emerged and how those have fared in court. What was the first attempt to counter Proposition 12?
Well, back in 2019, several national farm organizations challenged it, and they sought a declaratory judgment that the law was unconstitutional under the Dormant Commerce Clause. And they also wanted a permanent injunction preventing it from taking effect. Their claim was that it impermissibly regulated out-of-state conduct by compelling non-California producers to change their operations to meet California standards. So it makes straightforward sense on the claim. And they also claimed that Proposition 12 imposed excessive burdens on interstate commerce without any legitimate local interest because it significantly increased operation costs without any connection to human health or foodborne illness. And that's a key point on that one, because as we produce agricultural products, particularly food products, there is overriding governing federal law coming through the Food and Drug Administration and other federal agencies, as well as at the state level in every state, that is dealing with the human health and foodborne illness issue. And so what California is trying to do here, they're not going to supersede what the federal law says. And so the argument here is, look, this is an unnecessary, excessive burden on interstate commerce. You're not advancing any local interest because all these foodborne illness claims that you have are already governed by federal law. We can't produce products in a manner that's in violation of federal law. No matter where we're at in the United States, California, you're just imposing additional regulations for the sake of imposing additional regulations and protecting your own market there and your producers that are already subject to higher production costs from being undercut by producers that produce products in other states that don't have the same, as we would view it, ridiculous, burdensome regulations that you have in California. That's the argument.
An argument that, unfortunately for the plaintiffs, didn't pass muster with the trial court, you say?
That's right. The trial court, the federal district court out of California, and then on appeal, the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals, which affirmed the trial court. Basically, they said that because Proposition 12 was neither a price control nor a price affirmation statute, in other words, it didn't dictate the price of pork products or tie the price of pork products that are sold in California to an out-of-state price, then the law didn't have an extraterritorial effect of regulating prices in other states. And they basically said here, well, the pork market's not a national market, so national commerce is not being affected, so you don't have the concerns with the Commerce Clause. Well, from an economic standpoint, I think the court's a little bit off base there. We do have a national market for a lot of these ag products, including pork. And so what California does would affect the national market, particularly given the size of that California market, the number of people that are there. It's larger than many countries across the world. So it's a huge market. But the Ninth Circuit decided the other way, and it's not an impermissible effect on interstate commerce, according to the court.
And just as an interpretation, a sidebar, if you will, the court isn't terribly interested in whatever compliance costs the pork industry, in this case, would have to incur to satisfy Proposition 12 standards.
Yeah, they had to find a substantial burden on interstate commerce, and they said that, well, just because the compliance costs have gone up, they're projected 9.2% for these out-of-state producers, they'll just pass that on to consumers, and that's not a substantial burden on interstate commerce that violates the Dormant Commerce Clause.
Well, the U.S. Supreme Court, you note in your article on this topic in your blog recently, had a chance to review this case and declined to do so earlier this summer, right?
Yeah, they did before the Ninth Circuit issued their opinion earlier this summer. The U.S. Supreme Court was asked to just strike down Proposition 12 as unconstitutional, and they said, we're not going to do that. We're going to let it go through the court system. Well, that raises the question now as to whether the court's going to take up the Ninth Circuit decision if a request is filed for them to do so. I think that remains to be seen. And Eric, I'm not really optimistic that even if they do, they would overturn the Ninth Circuit. The Supreme Court, frankly, has been really careless in applying what we call the anti-discrimination test under the Commerce Clause. And in many cases, neither of the requirements to find a violation, interstate competition or harm to the national economy, they never mention that. They just pass over those things. And so, in most cases, your in-state and out-of-state actions compete in the same market. But harm to the national economy, they tend to overlook that because the court simply assumes the issue away. And we do have harm to the national market here, or it's projected right now, and I think it will be coming in 2022 because of this and because the California market is so large. But the problem, again, with the U.S. Supreme Court is they tend to simply assume that issue away and never squarely address it. So I'm not terribly optimistic that there would be a win at the U.S. Supreme Court, although we do have a couple of new justices since we've last had a major case on this, so there's a chance.
Well, obviously this is of great consequence specifically to the pork industry, but in conclusion here, you think that all of agriculture needs to be paying attention to what's going on with this particular development?
Oh, absolutely. It's not going to stop with this. If California can get away with doing this, what are they going to do next, and what might other states do to protect their particular sectors of ag? Let's say we've got Eastern Shore, Maryland, heavy in poultry production. They put up certain restrictions, seeing what California was able to do, and they put up restrictions to protect their poultry industry with stricter requirements that other poultry producers in other states don't currently meet. Where's this going to end? This is clearly, at least in my mind, what the framers intended to prevent the states from doing by enacting the Commerce Clause, preventing states from economic cannibalization of other states. So this is a really big issue, and I hope the Supreme Court addresses this and turns it around. I'm just not that optimistic based on how I've seen other cases on similar issues go in the past. But it's a huge issue for agriculture.
And that in mind, Roger's write-up on this in his blog, a very good read. Producers, get a look at that. He entitles it California's Regulation of U.S. Agriculture, simply put. It's at washburnlaw.edu/WALTR. Thanks for bringing this to our attention, Roger. In 2 weeks, we'll talk again.
Thank you, Eric.
Professor of Agricultural Law and Taxation, Washburn University School of Law, Roger McEowen, will return with more for you on this Agriculture Today. Broadcasting from the campus of Kansas State University, this is Agriculture Today, and welcome back. Eric Atkinson here. For you now, today's agricultural news headlines, courtesy in part of DTN. Farm income and loan repayment rates increased since 2020 at their fastest pace on record in the states covered by the Federal Reserve Bank of Kansas City. Reported by the bank in its latest Farm Income and Credit Conditions report, a strong farm economy and historically low interest rates led to a 10% increase in farm real estate values from a year ago. According to the report, that was the largest increase since 2013. The KC Fed, to remind, covers farmers and ranchers in Kansas, Colorado, Nebraska, Oklahoma, and Wyoming, as well as 43 counties in western Missouri and 14 counties in northern New Mexico. The report, quite detailed, we'll go through the highlights here. The improvement in farm finances eased the credit issues and contributed to softer demand for farm loans, according to the Fed. This based on a survey of agricultural bankers, of course. The outlook for profit opportunities in 2021 remained strong, they said, for most agricultural producers as commodity prices remained well above recent years. Conditions were somewhat weaker, says the Fed, in the cattle industry, and drought continued to hurt conditions for farmers and ranchers in several areas of the district. Now, nearly all banks reported increases in production expenses for both crop and livestock producers, as well as cash rental rates, which could pressure margins going forward. It went on to say, despite the potential headwinds, bankers were indicating they expected improvement in farm income and credit conditions to continue in the months ahead. Now, the Fed is pointing to strong commodity prices providing support for income during the second quarter of 2021 here. They found that bankers' optimism about farm income was greater than the previous quarter and corresponded with the strongest year-to-year turnaround in farm income since the survey began collecting that information back in 2002, according to the report. In addition, capital spending on farms continued to increase as a result of the higher incomes. The survey finding increased costs were slightly more prevalent for crop producers in nearly all states. 80% of all lenders said that expenses for all producers were at least modestly higher than 1 year ago. Despite that rise in expenses, they say, opportunities for profit remained significantly improved from recent years and continued to promote easing of agricultural credit stress, as the report read. Along with higher farm income, the survey found loan repayment rates increased from the previous year at the fastest pace on record, dropping considerably from recent years, they said. Only 15% of farm loans had repayment problems, including just 5% with major or severe issues, according to the report. The survey found also an improving farm economy leading to falling interest rates on farm loans across the district, and cash rents on all types of land also increasing, but at a slightly slower pace than farmland values. Cash rents on non-irrigated and irrigated crop ground rising about 7% from last year, rents for ranch land increasing slightly less than 1%. And a smaller number of banks said they expected increases in cash rents and land values over the next 3 months, according to the report. Well, I want to remind you that next in K-State and Kansas Livestock Association's series of KLA, K-State Ranch Management Field Days, is set for tomorrow, the 19th. The location this time is at the Roth Farm and Ranch near Sterling. On the program there, vaccinating for herd success, with K-State's A.J. Topoff contributing to that. Also a look at building a rotational grazing system. Retired Natural Resources Conservation Service Specialist in Range Management David Kraft will have that, and there'll be an update on the issues facing the cattle industry from the president of the National Cattlemen's Beef Association and Kansas cattle feeder Jerry Bone. The program gets going at 3 o'clock tomorrow afternoon. You can go to ksubeef.org to see the full rundown and particularly the directions to get to the Roth Farm and Ranch site near Sterling. Go to ksubeef.org for that. And the final KLA, K-State Ranch Management Field Day in the 2021 series will be held near Eskridge in Wabaunsee County. Scarlett Higgins tells us here that program will feature topics on using late-season burning to control Sericea lespedeza, managing external parasites for cattle, and enhancing wildlife habitat.
The event will be held on the Gun Barrel Ranch, owned and operated by Joe and Norma Hoagland, their son Dirk, his wife Natalie, and their 2 children, Dayton and Reed. Located in the Flint Hills, controlling Sericea lespedeza is important to preserving the health of the native prairie that supports the ranch's cow-calf and stocker operation. Therefore, the Hoaglands have worked with K-State Extension Beef Cattle Nutrition and Management Specialist Casey Olson to study how the use of late-season burning may help combat the invasive plant species and what impact burn time may have on average daily gain of stocker calves. He will discuss his research and walk attendees through a pasture where late-season burning has been utilized. Cassandra Olds, assistant professor in the Department of Entomology at K-State, will be on hand to break down various external parasite management methods for cattle. In addition, U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service biologist Greg Kramus and Kansas Department of Wildlife and Park staff Kent Frick and Darren Porter will discuss what the Gun Barrel Ranch is doing to enhance wildlife habitat, as well as various other concepts available to ranchers looking to do the same. To round out the program, National Cattlemen's Beef Association President Jerry Bone will give an update on industry issues being discussed in Washington, D.C., including cattle marketing and tax policy. The field day will begin with registration at 3 p.m. and conclude with a free beef dinner at 6:30 p.m. For more information and directions, including exact GPS coordinates to the August 24th field day, go to KLA.org and click on Events and Meetings. The field day is sponsored by the Farm Credit Associations of Kansas. I'm Scarlett Hagans.
And lastly, in today's agricultural news, agriculture and biofuels groups have asked for a rehearing on that July 2nd court ruling that, if allowed to stand, will end year-round sales of E15 in a petition filed with the U.S. Court of Appeals for the District of Columbia Circuit. On Monday, the National Corn Growers Association, Growth Energy, and the Renewable Fuels Association petitioned that circuit court for a rehearing before all judges in the circuit, arguing in the petition that the future of the ethanol and agriculture industries depends on the ability to expand availability of ethanol blends above E10. We'll be back with more for you after this break. You're tuned in to the K-State Radio Network and Agriculture Today. This is Agriculture Today. Stop, look, and listen.
Where some freshman students know why they want to go to college, I think many do not.
That's Gus Vanderhoeven of Kansas State University with comment on life in rural Kansas.
My agenda has a big circle around August 23rd, as it being the day classes start again. In early August, I did notice the vehicles coming back in town with furniture to get ready and settle in, and a friend remarked about the sudden increase in student noise of those students who settle in with parties. I expect the extra noise will soon settle down, as the students will have to learn to hit the books and study. That goes for all students, but especially the freshmen, some of which will not stay. The shock of what a university really is may hit them hard. Oh, they may hang on for a couple of weeks and then realize the hard studying is not for them. I will always remember a particular student who was at the top of the local high school in a small country town. It was not in Kansas, but this guy did not make it at the university. It was such a shock for him, so he dropped out. As he matured, he learned to pick up the pieces, and he did good. But I keep thinking of the initial shock he went through and what it meant to him and to his family. He was their star. Their star came home. Pointing fingers does not help. Accepting the fact that it happens and offering assistance is the first thing to do. Where some freshman students know why they want to go to college, I think many do not. And that, I think, is a problem and a challenge. I have seen it in our own family. It can be very tough to choose and think about what one wants to become and do with his or her life. Mistakes can be made, and mistakes can be costly, both emotionally and financially. College tuition is not cheap. I like to say to students whom I meet on entering the building as I hold the door for them, don't be afraid. Demand the very best. You are paying. Being older and gray, they want to be polite and hold the door for me. But I insist, repeating what I said earlier. You are paying. I know that high school counselors can be of tremendous help, but they only know so much. They cannot know it all, even though they may have grown older with the student, and if they are local, they may know the family which can help. But I think of a counselor and the options in today's job market. I wonder how much they can know to help a searching student. I know that I'm totally uneducated in this important matter, the matter being to choose the direction to study what becomes your career. That is why the start of studying general courses may be good, but it can also be a reminder of high school routine, more of the same, but now more as it should be. After all, this is a university. Are you prepared to study and explore? The willingness to explore subject matter is extremely important. And where I still love the books, I grant you, they are computer savvy. To be honest, I use the computer more and more, but I'm hesitant, impatient, untechnical. I also admit it can be overwhelming, and one has to learn what to look for. But if a student came to me and said, I like horticulture, where do I start? If the freshman did not come out of a family where horticulture is business, as dairy farming can be business, then he or she starts with a tremendous disadvantage. Horticulture is a science, and depending where you go with it, it's an art. For the art, I'm thinking of landscape design or landscape architecture. The difference between the two may be scope and scale of projects, but neither one is only art. It's art-based science. In my earlier career, I spent summers hoeing gladiola fields with a crew of 12 people. It was boring, interesting, and fascinating. The acreage of gladiola had to be weed-free. We were growing a crop. I was in charge. But do you need to go to college for that? Do not some of us have the ability to lead and be in charge to direct and manage? But we have to know what we manage, both the product which is grown and the people who work for us. Learning can be hard work, and it takes discipline. What about fruit production? Small fruit, big fruit, tropical fruit. What about vegetable production? Some young people have the strong desire to have their own business. I have them in my family, and I admire them. What if there is the interest to grow nursery stock? Nursery stock locally grown for local conditions, carefully selected to be adapted to local soils and climate. What about growing mushrooms? What about growing medicinal plants? What about the needed honeybees for pollinators? I could see someone having the interest to study landscape design principles to design landscape to mitigate the climate changes we are experiencing. I'll just say the word shade and think, what does that mean? For sure a tree, which indeed does give shade. It must be adapted and grow to a size we can use and not be too thirsty. We may need different sizes, different leaves, resistance to insects, able to withstand strong winds. I also want it to be attractive to look at. But that's not all. Where should it be planted in relation to the house or structure to give the needed benefit? You see, I could talk a whole day to a student and still not say it all. We need people who think in horticulture.
Gus Vander Hoeven of Kansas State University. Our time's away once more. Thanks for being along with us, and please rejoin us right here tomorrow, won't you? Until then, Eric Atkinson for Agriculture Today. This is the K-State Radio Network.